It is my pleasure this afternoon to welcome all of you to the Honors Lecture Series on American Values. My name is Dr. Philip Phillips, and I'm the Associate Dean of the Honors College here at Middle Tennessee State University. The speaker who was scheduled for today, because of unforeseen circumstances, is not able to be with us, and so we have altered our program to bring in another one of our distinguished speakers out of order. Someone all of you should know and recognize, someone who has attended, I think, all of our meetings this semester. Our speaker today is Dr. John Weil, who is the Dean of the University Honors College. He is a graduate of William and Mary, as well as Mr. Jeffersons University here. He's done some postdoctoral work at Princeton University, and he has a long and distinguished career in academia. Before coming to Middle Tennessee State University, he was at McNeese State University in Louisiana, where he started his career as a professor in political science. He went on to become the chair of the department there, and he left McNeese State to come to MTSU in order to be the chair of the political science department here at our university. He served in that role for 19 years before becoming the Dean of the Honors College, and I believe that this year marks his 10th year as Dean. And so we're very fortunate to have him here. I couldn't ask for a better person to work with on a daily basis. He is a scholar's scholar. I have given up on keeping track of the number of books that he has written, because even if I have counted them, he's already got one or two that are in the works in the event that he reaches the point at which he doesn't have anything else to write about. He is a scholar of the first rank. One of his major areas of expertise is the United States Constitution and the ratification of the Constitution and the amendment processes. And he is the most knowledgeable person you could imagine on those topics, and he's in frequent demand among different civic organizations, and he's been very kind to come and speak to some of the ones to which I belong. He's also very knowledgeable about the United States flag, and he is someone who is perfect for this honors lecture series on American values. So very grateful to him that he decided that he offered to step in today and give his lecture early. His talk is The Declaration of Independence and American Ideals. Please join me in welcoming Dean Weil.
Thank you. Sort of glad to get it done early. Delighted to be here. So, the Declaration of Independence, I'm assuming, and you'll see that I brought my little talismans with me today. Some people carry teddy bears. I carry around statues of Thomas Jefferson and other founding fathers. The Declaration of Independence dates, of course, to 1776. It's often referred to as the birth certificate of the nation. Its opening paragraphs are often referred to as the American or an American Creed. And although the document itself is faded, as some of you who accompanied me to D.C. will know, it remains a centerpiece. I believe it's the one to the immediate left here, the Constitution in the middle, Declaration of Independence here, and then the Bill of Rights to the right. This is sort of the holy of holies of American documents, the American archives in Washington, D.C. And just to give another indication of that's another picture of that, of its value, this is someone who in a local thrift shop within the last 10 years or so bought what's known as a stone engraving of the Declaration, which dates to 1823. He paid, if I recall correctly, about $2.48. It was on sale, and it ended up going at auction for $477,000. So that is some indication of the collectible value often tells you the value of something in the popular mind, and that's certainly the case with this. Independence Day, of course, every year is on the date that the Declaration of Independence was signed, and some of America's greatest celebrations have centered on commemorations of the Declaration of Independence, going at least as far, well, pretty much from the first year forward. There was a particularly big event scheduled for 1826. We're going to come back to that in a little bit. In 1876, there was the centennial. In 1926, there was the sesquicentennial. In 1976, when my wife and I got married, just a week before, we had the bicentennial. And if I live long enough, I am hoping to celebrate the sesquicentennial, which will be 2026. So, has a long and illustrious history. And of course, it was signed, as was the Constitution and the Articles of Confederation, in Independence Hall in Philadelphia. So, one of the books that I have just completed is an encyclopedia on the Declaration of Independence. Surprisingly, there isn't one. There will be, probably come next year. The problem with doing an encyclopedia is you tend to think in segments of 250 to 1,000 words, and so today I'm going to try to give you a little bit more of an overview, particularly with a view to the principles of the Declaration of Independence. So, let's start with a little bit of colonial background. For the most part, the 13 colonies that became the original 13 states were settled or eventually became conquered by or under the authority of Great Britain. As Dr. Evans's lecture early in our semester indicated, people came to the United States for a variety of reasons. Economic were some of them. Some came for religious, some came for political freedom. And to a large degree, the American colonies had exercised a good deal of freedom, in part just because of geography. We were pretty far away from Great Britain. A lot of decisions, you can't appeal to the king to decide what to do about a Native American attack or about a famine or whatever situation might arise. You have to take things into your own hand. And so representative government was brought over from England. If you go to Virginia, one of the earliest colonies, the House of Burgesses, which is their legislative body, dates back to 1619 rather. So there's a long history of self-government in Great Britain. There is something of a change brought about, and I probably needed another slide here, but what's known generally as the 7 Years' War, what's known in the United States as the French and Indian War. And many of you know, as a result of that war, which largely pitted colonial and British interests in the 13 colonies against Canadian and French interests to the north, Canada was turned over to Great Britain. And in some ways, this was a boon for the 13 lower colonies because they still had the threat of Spain to the south, but there was always this possibility that there could be a threat from the French in the north, so that was eliminated. But as a result, they didn't necessarily need to be quite as closely tied to Britain as they had before. And for its part, Britain had spent quite a bit of blood and treasure in winning the French and Indian conflict, and they thought it was only appropriate that the colonists pay their fair share. Now, I'll tell you that the colonists thought they had already done so by supplying troops and other things that they had done, but many of you know, if you've just had your introductory American history or even an introductory history class in high school, you know that beginning shortly after the end of the French and Indian War in 1764, the British Parliament began asserting its authority to raise various taxes. Taxes on sugar, the so-called stamp tax, later the Townsend duties, and many others. And basically there was sort of a philosophical standpoint. As representative government had developed in Great Britain, it primarily developed around the authority of Parliament, because the main way to attain liberty in Britain seemed to be to trim the power of the king. And so those who favored Whig or Republican principles tended to indicate parliamentary authority, whereas in the United States, the Americans who had brought British principles with them, they thought they had brought British citizenship with them, and among the principles that Britons adhered to was a principle in the Magna Carta of 1215, no taxation without representation. And so the colonists did not believe that it was fair for them to be taxed by a legislative body in which they had no representatives. And so you end up with something of a stalemate here. The colonists initially think that the solution is, they look at their history and they say, most of us began as colonies with charters from the king. We're going to regard these charters as what we today would call a type of constitution. So we think it's the responsibility of the king to step in here and guarantee the rights that we thought we brought with us as British citizens. Now, as it turns out, of course, their hopes that the king would intervene on their behalf largely proved to be fruitless. But at least there's general agreement among historians that at least until about January 1776, that most Americans remained loyal to George III. I'm working on a book right now on Benjamin Rush, who was a doctor who signed the Declaration of Independence, and he's among others who basically, his letters prior to this time basically indicate that he was loyal, and most people in the United States remained loyal to George III. In this context, an immigrant, and it'd be interesting to know, I think it's usually P-A-I-N-E, but I wonder if he spelled his name both ways. I'm not sure on that. I need to check that. In any event, in January of 1776, Thomas Paine wrote a pamphlet known as Common Sense, and what he primarily did was to question the authority and the wisdom of monarchy and of hereditary succession. The fact that monarchy passes from one heir to another regardless of their, regardless of their qualifications. And interestingly, to my knowledge, the only person other than Thomas Paine and the printer who saw this publication prior to January of 1776 was none other than my friend Dr. Benjamin Rush. Rush apparently, in part because he didn't want to take the onus with a medical practice of saying something any more controversial than he had already said, apparently encouraged Paine to write this book. Paine originally wanted to call the book Plain Truth, and Rush at least claims credit for having changed the title to Common Sense. So it's published in January of 1776, and there are a lot of people in the United States who are starting to get into this idea of independence and liberty. Now, it's going to take a while, but among them is the famed wife of John Adams, who writes a letter that many of you are probably familiar with, usually called the Remember the Ladies letter, in which she says, you know, while you guys are beginning to think about independence from Great Britain, you need to think about giving us some rights. And then these famous words, remember, all men would be tyrants if they could, and that he needed to look out after the care of the ladies. Now, as far as I can tell, his response was fairly, he took it more, I think, humorously probably than a contemporary man would. But nonetheless, there were many people who were beginning to say, as we'll get to the Declaration of Independence, if you're going to declare people to be equal, then why do you have slavery? And there were other institutions that began to be affected by revolutionary sentiment. Now, let's look at a couple other documents. I'm actually jumping one ahead. want to talk about a document that was written or published on October the 14th of 1774. This was a document by the First Continental Congress called the Declaration and Resolves. And interestingly, in early American history, when people referred to the Bill of Rights, they were more commonly referring to this document than they were to the first 10 amendments, which we today typically identify as the Bill of Rights. But what's interesting about this Declaration and Resolves is that in making the colonial case, the document cites three major sources. One we're going to see in the Declaration of Independence. It refers to what it calls the immutable laws of nature. Secondly, it refers to the principles of the English Constitution. So that lets you know that there's, you're still professing, you can't claim the rights of the British unless you're still loyal to the British. So in 1774, they still view themselves as British citizens, but they appeal to human rights, the rights of Britain, and then consistent with what I've told you about their reliance on the king, they also appeal to the several charters or compacts. This appeal basically goes unheeded. Many of you know that in April 1775, fighting breaks out, Lexington and Concord, between American colonists and the British, and then we'll go back, won't we do that? Then shortly after, or a couple months after that, Common Sense is published. In June of 1776, and I think that's where we are, Virginia adopts something known as its Declaration of Rights. And the first sentence is written by Mr. George Mason, who was sort of a country squire there in Virginia, a neighbor of George Washington. It says, and we can just look, all men are by nature equally free and independent. They have certain inherent rights of which when they enter into a state of society, they cannot by any compact deprive or divest their posterity, namely the enjoyment of life and liberty with the means of acquiring and possessing property. Now we'll see a little bit of difference here. This is life, liberty, and property. When we get to the Declaration, it will alter that language just a little bit. Something else, these are not actually the original words that Mason used. The Virginia delegates, remember I told you how some of the wise are starting to say maybe we need to be treated equal, and others are saying maybe slaves need to be treated equal. And Virginia was a very big slaveholding state, and so you have language here that tends to exclude or potentially excludes African Americans, because you could argue that they're not part of this social contract. Therefore, they don't have the same rights. But in any event, we have this. It's sort of a model. Mr. Jefferson, of course, is a Virginian, so he'd be familiar with this. On June the 7th of 1776, well, somewhat earlier, Virginia adopts three resolutions, and Richard Henry Lee, who is a delegate from Virginia, adopts a resolution that will result in the Declaration of Independence. Resolve that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be dissolved. That language will reappear in the final paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. Now, Lee, when he introduced this resolution, he introduced two other resolutions. One was to seek foreign allies. Britain, you'll recall, is one of the greatest empires of all times. Many people thought it was very tenuous to declare independence from a country this powerful if they didn't want you to be independent. And then he also proposed that Congress begin working on an actual constitution that would govern the colonies. And that ultimately became what we call the Articles of Confederation. So that's introduced on June the 7th. There are some preliminary debates in which they decide to postpone actual voting and further speech making on the Declaration of Independence for about 3 weeks. But in the interim, they propose a committee of 5 individuals, Mr. Jefferson there on the right, Mr. Franklin on the left, and then John Adams in the middle. Also on the committee were Roger Sherman of Connecticut and Robert Livingston of New York. As we will see, most of the writing was done by Mr. Jefferson. There's some indication that Mr. Franklin and Mr. Adams did a little bit of proofreading, I guess you would say, prior to it going to Congress. It then goes to Congress. It's debated line by line, much to the chagrin of Mr. Jefferson, who had fairly thin skin and just found it excruciating to have to listen to people tear apart his product. And in fact, for many years, Mr. Jefferson would send copies of his original declaration, which he continued to believe was superior to the declaration that was actually adopted by the Congress. Now, just to go through some of the mechanics of this, right, Mr. Jefferson. Okay, and I put slave quarters in here because I don't want to, we don't want to forget that despite some of the lofty ideals of the Declaration of Independence, they were not always put into immediate practice, and that's important for us to remember. But let's talk a little bit about the printing of the Declaration of Independence. There was a vote finally taken on independence itself on July 2nd. There was subsequently debate on the actual document, and the document is adopted as an explanation of the right. The document is adopted as an explanation of what the colonies were doing on July 4th. Now, there's a famous letter, and I didn't write it down on my notes here, but I can almost do it to you from memory, in which John Adams writes home, probably to Abigail, on July 2nd and says something like, from here on out, this is going to be a day that's immortal in world history. We're going to have firecrackers, we're going to have bonfires, people are going to be giving speeches and whatever. Well, he was right, he just got it 2 days off. Instead of celebrating when we actually declared independence, we ended up celebrating the day that we adopted the document, which officially explained our reasons for independence. And there's some indication there that there's a little bit of, that part of this was frankly because the next Congress didn't really think about having a holiday until it was already July 2nd, and somebody said, well, we can't do it today, let's do it on the 4th, or something fairly close to that. So, the Declaration, there's an oddity about the Declaration of Independence, which is what we associate with the Declaration of Independence actually is not the first document. Now, the first document probably on which the Declaration of Independence was written was probably a handwritten copy by Mr. Jefferson on what's called foolscap, just the letter that would have been used for there. And he was probably the one or someone else at Congress who marked through all the different changes that were made and then would have sat on the evening of July 4th with the publisher, with a printer by the name of John Dunlap, who typically worked for the Pennsylvania legislature. So the first document of the Declaration of Independence is actually unsigned. You see a printed signature of John Hancock. You see the printed signature of Charles Thompson, who was the president of the Continental Congress, but you do not see the individual signatures that we today associate with it. And so the first document that the public would have seen would have been this sometime after July 4th, probably initially in newspapers, and then copies of this document were made and sent to each of the state capitals as well as to troops in the field. Part of the purpose of the Declaration of Independence, Part of the purpose of the Declaration of Independence was sort of to rally people to the cause, explain, why it was important to separate from Great Britain. So we start with this, and then on July, I'm going to get my dates a little mixed up. In the next couple weeks, and I believe it's July 19th, right, when the initial vote on the Declaration of Independence is 12-0. New York delegates do not yet have authority. Well, that's actually wrong. The vote that counts. There was a vote before that, which was like 10-2, and then two states delegates either change their mind or decide not to come so that there will be a majority. So you have a 12-0 vote, and then New York gets authorization from its legislature to also vote for independence. That happens on June 19th. And then this document becomes converted, if you will, into an artifact. It is written out on parchment, and this was done by someone by the name of Timothy Matlock. And this is probably the one that you're most familiar with, John Hancock's famous signature there in the center. And then the delegates signed, this is from north to south, like this, from right to left, north to south, again with Hancock being in the middle because he's the president of the convention. And I think if I said that Thompson was the president, he was the secretary. Okay, sorry about that if I made a mistake there. So that's sort of the history of the printing. Now let's talk a little bit about one other famous event. The period in time that the Declaration of Independence probably becomes most firmly fixed in the American mind is in 1826. Now, we knew about it before then, obviously. Initially, Mr. Jefferson's authorship of the Declaration of Independence was not widely known. So if we go to this document, and it's going to take me a while to find it, but his is right there. That hardly indicates, does it, that he's the primary author. It's not till the early 1800s that it becomes somewhat widely known that Jefferson was the author, and there were a lot of people who were fairly dismissive, particularly his political opponents. Some of them accused him basically of plagiarizing. There's not much in the Declaration of Independence other than a little bit of warmed over John Locke and some of the other documents, and surprisingly, Jefferson doesn't particularly deny this. He does say that he hadn't copied it from any particular previous work, but he goes on to say it wasn't intended to be an original document. It was intended to be, and these are his words, an expression of the American mind. And so one of the reasons that we go to the Declaration of Independence is if he was right, if he succeeded, then Jefferson presumably was not only giving his own personal philosophy, but the philosophy of everyone. And one of my pet peeves about interpretations of the Declaration of Independence is there's sort of a syllogism that goes like this. Mr. Jefferson believed X. His views of God, his views of government, his views of agriculture. And then you say, Mr. Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, therefore the Declaration of Independence must mean X. Not at all. Well, not at all is probably too far. I don't think Mr. Jefferson probably expressed opinions that he didn't agree with, but he was writing a document for a specific time and place that was designed to reflect a contemporary consensus. So just because Mr. Jefferson had one or another views on a political or religious issue does not necessarily mean that and even if he had tried secretly to incorporate them in the Declaration of Independence, that would be useless, right? I don't care about Mr. Jefferson's secret interpretation of the Declaration of Independence. I want to know, what did people at the time think the Declaration of Independence meant? So that's how I'm going to try to interpret the Declaration of Independence. Now, Mr. Rush, that I mentioned before, medical doctor, that when he's the first person ever to write about 55 of the 56 delegates to the who signed the Declaration of Independence, and he consistently uses two terms, liberty and independence. They are the two things that he thinks the Declaration of Independence was most designed to illumine. So I'm going to begin with independence. So that's sort of the obvious one. the primary task of the Declaration of Independence, and there's your title, right? Independent, Declaration of Independence. Who is it independence of? It's not my independence from everybody else or Mr. Jefferson's independence. It's the independence of America, of the 13 colonies from Britain. Now, I will admit right off the bat that there's some ambiguity. You can read it one of two ways. You can read it as we're one country that's now independent of Britain, or you can sometimes read it as there are 13 colonies, each of which is declaring their independence. And if you know anything about American history, you know that questions of federalism, relationship between the nation and the states, continued certainly through the Civil War and have continued even to this day. So that's still not completely separate or completely decided, but these are the opening words of the Declaration. I like to put them up there because sometimes people will tell me that the opening words are "We the people." That's the Constitution. This is a Declaration of Independence. So, what are they asserting? We're going to assume separate and equal station, and then we have this phrase, which is probably, now it's not unique, we've seen something similar here in the Virginia Declaration of Rights, but nature and nature's God. What does that mean? What does it mean? Let's see. Yeah, I think what it is again, go back to Mr. Jefferson's attempt. Mr. Jefferson is not just expressing his personal theological views, which are very interesting, but pretty much irrelevant. What he's trying to do is get people, whether their primary emphasis is that of Christians, who would refer directly to God, or whether it's primarily that of what we might call deists, who are going to put more focus on God sort of being divorced, sort of leaving the world here by itself, letting things run by nature. He's saying whichever method of these or whichever combination you use, they suggest that we are entitled to separation. Okay, so that's our first sentence. Now, this is the part that is the most quoted. And I need to tell you, as much as I love to discuss these first two paragraphs, that's all they are. You have a document that has about 28 different charges against the king, and the primary onus of the document is much like a legal brief. It's designed to show that Britain has mistreated the colonies and that George III is a tyrant, and that as a tyrant, we have the right to claim our rights, to become free and independent. But you do have to ask, why did Mr. Jefferson do this? Why did he include something that we might very well regard as a kind of national creed? And my suspicion is, not suspicion, I think my educated judgment is that there were a lot of people who reflected these sentiments. Now, all men are created equal. Obvious question there is, does that include women? I'm going to give a tentative yes. I think the word meant, well, okay, be careful here. I believe it should include women. Did Mr. Jefferson intend for it to include women? I think he's generally referring to humankind or mankind. That was common at this time. Women were not, of course, immediately given the same political rights as men were. Okay, and they're unalienable rights, unalienable something that you cannot give up. And then we have the three that we've already mentioned: life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. So, well, let's back up. How are men created equal? Or how are men and women? How are human beings created equal? We're obviously not all equally good looking, right? We're not equally endowed with intellectual faculties. We don't have necessarily equal amounts of wealth, family reputation, etc., etc. But, if you ask me, he says we're equal in rights. Whatever else it means, we should not be treated differently because, by governments at least, because of our wealth, because of our looks, because of our intellect. We today sometimes refer to sort of equal dignity and respect. That's probably a little bit higher than where the Declaration goes, but I think we're close there. And then we get the threesome: life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. Why doesn't he say life, liberty, and property? That tends to be John Locke, often regarded as sort of the British theorist who influenced classical liberal thought, which the Declaration of Independence is often associated with. He often used that threesome: life, liberty, property. Why doesn't Mr. Jefferson? And there are a couple explanations. First, there are people at the time who had used the term happiness generally as a purpose of government. So it really wasn't, there's not much that's terribly novel in the Declaration of Independence, and if it had been, it probably wouldn't have been adopted. Again, it's designed to be a reflection of the American mind. Some people think he did happiness as a stylistic measure. Some people say, well, think about it, property is alienable. We routinely buy and sell cars, houses, books, other things. So it might be a right, but it's not an unalienable or inalienable, as Mr. Jefferson had originally said. And some people, by the way, believe that he was trying to avoid making people think that you could have property in individuals, which would have been the claim of slaveholders. He himself was, of course, a slaveholder, but at least in his early years, he did express great philosophical reservations about the institution of slavery. So it's possible that it was actually a fairly enlightened, remember the phrase that I gave you back from the Virginia Declaration of Rights, where they tried to exclude African Americans by saying it only applies to people who enter into a social contract. So here it would not exclude people who might be considered property. And then, continuing on, I don't know that we did continue on. The rest of the opening of the Declaration of Independence is designed to present a case for a right to revolution. So this right is predicated on governments are established for certain limited purposes: life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. If government is not fulfilling that purpose, the people have the right to get rid of this government and replace it with a government that does fulfill these purposes. Okay, so you have it's not a right to anarchy, but collectively the people, if they decide, and today, of course, we would typically express the right to get a new government through what? Through existing elections, through mechanisms that we already have within a constitution. They don't have such a mechanism there, at least not one that's working effectively for them. Now, this takes us to the great majority of the Declaration of Independence is actually a list of grievances against the king. So if you were to go down collectively, you would find that the first 12, well, I forget how many, but the first large chunk of accusations begin with the word he, or the words he has. He is an unnamed king we know to be George III. Okay, so I got him up here. He has. And then Mr. Jefferson will give you things that he has done. And then you'll get to a portion in these accusations that say he has combined with others. Now, remember, long before the Declaration of Independence is adopted, the colonists have pretty much collectively decided that they do not accept the sovereignty, the power of the English Parliament to tax them. So you don't want to even acknowledge him by name for fear of giving them legitimacy. So you say the king has done bad things and he's combined with these others, the Parliament. They've done bad things. And then when you get to the last 5 or 6 accusations, you will basically see a list of war atrocities. You will see things that have happened from April of 1775 to July 1776, which seem to show the king's desire to make war on the colonies. Now, I've left out a couple, obviously, quite a few documents here, Second Continental Congress, or the Continental Congresses, had adopted some resolutions, most notably something known as the Olive Branch Petition. Telling the king, we're still here, we're still upset by what Parliament is going to try to do, please help us, and the king had rejected these. And one of the indications that the king had rejected it is he began almost immediately, he declared basically that the colonies were in rebellion, and he began recruiting troops from Germany and other European nations to send to the colonies. So that was a pretty good indication that he was not going to come to their rescue. Now, it's important to understand that the Declaration of Independence, I mentioned earlier, people get confused between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. The Declaration of Independence explains why the colonies are seeking separation. It does not set up a government. But I would argue that there are many, if you read in the accusations against the king, you can see the kind of government that Mr. Jefferson and the committee members and the Continental Congress are seeking. For example, he says, at more than one place, but at least one, the right of representation in the legislature is a right inestimable to them and formidable to tyrants only. So he's saying we're anticipating, one of the grievances we have against the king is that he's constantly dismissing our legislatures. He's putting them in unusual times. He's making us go a great distance to get there. That's unacceptable. Mr. Jefferson puts great emphasis on jury trials. He says one of the things the king is trying to do is he's trying to send Americans over to Great Britain or up to Nova Scotia, where their only judges are going to be English judges. They're not going to have a jury of their peers. He emphasizes the right of petition, which will later appear within the First Amendment. He stresses the importance of formal charters and adherence to them, which arguably is reflected in early state constitutions and later in the U.S. Constitution. He opposes the king for making the military superior to civilian authorities. That's the principle of civilian control of the military, which is essential to our own Constitution. So, although it's not a constitution, you get a pretty good idea of the kind of principles for which the colonists were fighting by looking through this list of grievances that they have. And then we mentioned earlier, Mr. Richard Henry Lee here, this is incorporated at the very end. For the support of this declaration, and by the way, one of the changes that Congress made in Mr. Jefferson's declaration is they added several references to God. So here we have a sentence, for the support of this declaration with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to ourselves, to each other, our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Colleagues and I have been having a discussion. Almost everybody who interprets that phrase interprets the word fortune to refer to money. And I'm not going to deny that it has that, but I argue that it has a secondary meaning, which is we share a common fortune. We are all in this together. As Mr. Franklin said, we are either going to hang together or we're going to hang separately from the end of British nooses. And it's probably important to point out that in the eyes of Great Britain, the Declaration of Independence is in effect a statement of treason. It is going against the constituted authority as recognized in Great Britain. And there were signers of the Declaration of Independence who did end up, in fact, Richard Stockton, who was Mr. Rush's father-in-law, ended up being imprisoned and mistreated in a fairly bad way. I'm going to end with an advertisement. Last spring, we took a group of 25 of you to historic sites in Virginia, and Washington, D.C., and we're hoping to repeat that trip again next spring. It's fairly reasonable. We really work hard to keep costs down. That includes driving back on the last evening so we can shave off a little bit of a motel and whatever. But we had, some of you were on that trip, other than my wife and Miss Lyons. Anyway, we had a good time, didn't we? And I would certainly encourage that. Okay, are there any questions or comments? Yes, okay. You should get an award. You almost always ask a question, and they're usually good. Okay.
Thank you. I'm just curious. So this is out of curiosity.
Yes.
So since the Declaration was written, we've known how the U.S. history was, particularly in terms of its growth.
Yes.
Particularly acquiring Alaska, Samoa Island, Puerto Rico, the British Islands, the dogma of manifest destiny, all those things. So, from your analysis of the Declaration of Independence, does it speak of just the notion that, we're going to assert our independence from England, but we reserve the right to impose some degree of tyranny over others?
That's a great question. Historically, we have sometimes done so. Probably the most notorious would be in the aftermath of the Spanish-American War. We took Spanish territories, basically made them our own, and continued colonial rule. Now in time, of course, Philippines gets its independence. Puerto Rico still doesn't have independence, but that's partly by their choices. I mean, that's a little bit more complicated. But yes, there have been times in American history. I guess if I could, my own spin would be one of the greatest accomplishments, not so much of the Declaration, but perhaps inspired by it, was that the Constitution that was adopted in 1787 made provision for the incorporation of future states on an equal basis with the old. And if you read, as I have, the debates during the convention, there were a lot of people at the convention in 1787 who were convinced that people on the American frontier were a little better than Native Americans, and they didn't regard Native Americans very highly. These were savages, these were uncivilized people. But the majority said, hold on, these are our sons and daughters that are going to be moving westward. It's important that they be, and had we not, we could very well have followed the policy of Great Britain, which probably would have resulted in an independent West. And some of you know, Aaron Burr was among those who had a plan, apparently had a plan at one time to break off part of the southwest part of the United States as a different country. And there was actually fear in 1787 that the 13 colonies could break into the eastern or the eastern, or what we call the northern states, the middle and the south, and then later western. So I think overall we've had a pretty good record with this, but we have had a few cases, most notably, and I guess Hawaii would probably be another example. We basically, took something because we wanted it, and certainly some of that happened after the Spanish-American War. But fortunately, most people, some of the founders will talk about an empire, but they usually modify it. It's designed as an empire of liberty. And we haven't always lived up to that ideal, but it's pretty good. If we want to call ourselves an empire, let's let it be an empire of liberty rather than, just how much space can we occupy and how many people, can we get to do our will. And of course, the greatest failure, which goes without saying, of both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution is, and it's hypocritical, right? To say all men are, even forgetting men and women, for the moment, to say all men are created equal, but we're going to hold some as slaves, and in Mr. Jefferson's case, maybe even some as mistresses, that doesn't quite live up to the ideal that we articulated. I think the ideal itself in time had a leavening effect that we can be grateful for, but, practicality intervened, and there was a great deal of wealth involved in the ownership of slaves, And unfortunately, many of the people at the convention thought that slavery would die out on its own. And unfortunately, Mr. Eli Whitney came along and invented the cotton gin, and there were other developments that continued to make slavery economically viable in a way that it was not so much in the northern states. Anyway, it got me off on a soapbox. Anyone else? Yes?
So we live in a world that's quickly changing with technological advancements and all sorts of things around us. How do you see the interpretation of the Declaration changing in the future and also on all these documents?
Well, I mean, the document has been much imitated. Actually, the North Vietnamese, used a version of the Declaration of Independence in trying to get independence from France. But they weren't particularly interested in giving what I would consider to be liberty to their own people when they advanced that document. So, but it has had an influence, as had the Virginia Declaration of Rights, as had the American Bill of Rights. We still have something of an oddity among democratic nations. There are probably more democratic nations that have a parliamentary system rather than a presidential system. But, I think many of the early American documents, they still resonate with me. I mean, I read them and I say, this isn't just something that somebody could believe back in 1776. Some of these are, principle all men are created equal, that we're all entitled to rights. I think that's a living, breathing principle. I'm glad it now includes women. I'm glad it includes African Americans. But, at the time, it was more a matter of theory, and I hope at least that it's become more a matter of practice over historical time. Okay, I know we're getting close, so I guess we'd have one more question if somebody has one. If you don't, I'm going to hang around a while. Okay, thank you very much.